Greetings and welcome back to CMST 245 online at South Seattle Community College. This is your professor, Rebecca McCarthy, and I hope that this podcast finds you happy and well today. This week we'll be focusing on Chapter 6, Identity, Identification, and Social Media in our book, Rhetoric Online, The Politics of New Media. And we're going to talk very specifically about this concept, once again, of identification. This is a concept you have already come across. When we talked about the concept of interactivity and how true interactivity is actually created, or full, that is, interactivity, when we are able to create identification between the person and the content, the person and the text, face-to-face, online, so on and so forth. So one of the things we learned about identification early on is that identification is often created through division. And what we mean by this is rather simple, is often we define who we are by saying who we are not. And by doing this, we can create more specific identification for ourselves. For example, one of the examples I often use is, I am a bookworm, not a cheerleader. I do this in order to suggest that I belong to a certain quote-unquote group of people rather than belonging to another quote-unquote group of people. If you look at politics, if you look at the ways which products are sold, they are often creating identification through division. For example, I am a Coke drinker and not a Pepsi drinker. I am a McDonald's girl and not a Subway person, right? I am basically saying what I am myself by saying what I am not. And when we watch commercials, often commercials will do that as well. They will use division in order to strengthen their identity with you, the person who's going to buy their product. So that is one of the first aspects of identification that is extremely important. But let's look more at this term specifically, because the authors really dive into this term quite deeply in this particular chapter. One of the quotes that the authors use from Kenneth Burke comes from Kenneth Burke's work, Rhetoric of Motives, and let me read it in its entirety. This can be found on page 97. As for the relation between identification and persuasion, we might well keep it in mind that the speaker persuades an audience by the use of stylistic identifications. His act of persuasion may be for the purpose of causing the audience to identify with the speaker's interests, and the speaker draws on identification of interests to establish a rapport between himself and his audience. Now, in everyday use, you and I do this all the time. For example, let's pretend we're having a conversation over coffee. And let's say that you are telling me about this horrible car accident that you got into because some jerk cut you off on the freeway. Well, what if in the middle of you telling that story, I stop you and go, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. About 2 weeks ago, this semi did the same thing. They just about pushed me off the road. I swear to God I was going to get in a crash, and I got lucky. But I am so sorry about that car. What I'm doing here is I'm pulling on a moment in my life that creates identification to the moment that you are giving me. And we do this all the time in conversations. A matter of fact, I challenge you to be ultra aware of all the times you interrupt or add to a conversation by showing how you truly identify with the story that you are being given. And this is partly why identification is a form of unconscious rhetoric. We actually seek to identify ourselves with other people. We really want to identify. We want to make that connection, whether we are face-to-face or online. Simple persuasion, which is, of course, again, how Aristotle basically defined rhetoric. Simple persuasion is a very conscious form of rhetoric. That means I consciously try to figure out a way to persuade you to agree with me. But identification works on a whole different kind of subconscious level. And that's really important because although persuasion on a very conscious level can be very effective, identification is more effective because we are all of a sudden enacting many different unconscious aspects in our brain in order to get agreement between each other. And that is why this other idea of absolute agreement becomes important to Kenneth Burke. Consubstantiality, which is a term you'll find at the bottom of 97, talks about coming together fully and absolutely. To define this term, this means that there is coexistence in the same substance. We often talk about consubstantiality when we are talking about the Trinity, for example, in religion. God, the Son, and the Holy Ghost is considered being part of the same thing. That is, each aspect, God, the Son, the Holy Ghost, they are three separate but also three singular things, and they come together perfectly. So what happens when we actually achieve consubstantiality? When we come together absolutely perfectly and our interests are so in line, are so at one with each other that there seems to be no place where I start and you finish. Well, if there was pure identification, that is absolute consubstantiality, then there would be no strife. You and I would agree on everything and absolutely every possible moment in the world. Of course, true consubstantiality, that is true and pure identification, actually never occurs. And if it does, it occurs in moments, in split seconds, and then it falls apart and demolishes again, because strife always tends to show itself in this moment or in that moment. But the idea of creating pure identification, that is often what we attempt to do when we look at politics or we look at other situations. So when we're looking at this particular chapter here, we want to see how identification actually is working through social media and how different people use social media in order to encourage identification. Now, some of the examples that are given is Domino's Pizza and also Papa John's Pizza. And both of these campaigns in which the authors actually discuss demonstrate how they are trying to find ways to create identification between the product, between the company, and then between consumers. One way is through the work of humanitarian work. The other example is through how the company, although it is a national company, tries to make itself look like it's local in order to create identification on the terms of local interests. They also look at social politics and a couple people's Facebook pages. And what happens when Rand Paul, for example, offers aspects from his personal life on his Facebook page and not just his politics for his readers. Indeed, identification is actually heightened in this particular situation because people can identify with the everydayness of Rand Paul's life, and as a result then start to identify more with the politics as well. So these are, I think, three really fantastic examples that they offer. Now I'm going to go on to the next section, which is constitutive rhetoric. First, let's break out this term to try to understand it. What does this mean? Well, constitutive means making a thing what it is, it's essential, having the power to institute, establish, or enact. So that is the basic definition of this term. So what does it mean when we look at it through the lens of rhetoric? In his 1987 essay on constitutive rhetoric, The Case of the People of Quebec, basically what is being suggested by Maurice Chartlin is this idea that it's not enough just to call a bunch of people together to have them listen to what you have to say. You have to give them a reason why. You have to give them an invitation to identify with you. And let me read from this quote from our textbook so that maybe will help clarify this idea. It is necessary to place someone in the position of wanting to hear a story before it can be successfully told. There must be an invitation of the reader to engage in the text. So in order for identification to ever even start occurring, an invitation needs to happen. So what does this mean for us? Well, if we look at a political speech, for example, let's say Obama was coming to town and was going to give a free meet and greet down, at Westlake Center. So we all get this invitation and we go. Now, the invitation itself that there's going to be a gathering sometimes isn't enough to make the people interact and identify with Obama. The invitation to meet at this place or to involve themselves or ourselves in this text may not be enough. Once Obama gets there, Obama may need to go the extra step in order to put us in the position to really want to engage with him, so that we aren't just seeing him as being a celebrity, we are seeing him as being our celebrity all of a sudden. We are seeing him as somebody who identifies with our own interests. So how and in which ways can we create this invitation for identification to occur? And that's one of the things that our authors are looking at. And we get lots of different examples of how this could happen. For example, on page 105, there is the apology. And the authors look at how many of famous people and important people actually have been using Twitter, and sometimes using Twitter inappropriately, and having to go online and apologize for what they have to say and their actions. There's also this discussion about agency and how social media allows us the ability to take charge of our own life and our own agency to make things happen, and this can create identification with another audience. They also have the discussion of the narrative, or telling a story, which also creates identification as well. So this chapter is really interesting in the sense that it gives us an overall fascinating understanding of these larger-than-life rhetorical terms and theories that are used a great deal, and how it actually functions in everyday life, especially with social media. So I hope that this podcast kind of cleared up some ideas for you, and I look forward to talking about all these issues a little bit more specifically on the discussion boards this week. So until then, you guys have a terrific week, and I will see you on the boards. Goodbye.